Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Karen Rice, and I am the chair of the School of Social Work at Millersville University. On behalf of the Learning Institute Committee, it is my honor to welcome you to our first documentary and dialogue series of the 2020-2021 academic year. We are grateful to be able to continue to offer these events in a virtual environment, as our advocacy for social justice and human rights must not stop. And in fact, this pandemic has further highlighted the inequities in our policies, practices, and institutions. At the Learning Institute, we aim to promote global citizenship. Rooted in a human rights framework, the events offered through the Learning Institute are dedicated to raising awareness, increasing knowledge, and enhancing justice, advocacy, and activism. Our events would not be possible without the dedication of the many faculty, staff, and students from across Millersville University who comprise the Learning Institute Committee. Before we begin, I want to briefly remind you of some Zoom logistics. I believe you all have received them in an email prior to tonight's event, but to reiterate, please remember to sign in by sending your name in a private chat to Sheena Landis. To increase bandwidth and to prevent interference during the discussion, please remain muted with your cameras off. This does not apply to the panelists and moderator. We encourage you to stay engaged, and you will be able to type comments and questions for the panelists after the documentary. Finally, for those receiving CEUs, you do have to stay for the entire event and complete the survey that you will receive via email within 48 hours. So it is now my honor to introduce to you our esteemed panelist and moderator for tonight's event. For Montgomery, Alabama native, Hannah Victoria Mason, the fight for justice runs in the family. She was related by marriage to the late civil rights legend, Johnny Carr, and her maternal grandparents participated in the Montgomery bus boycott, as well as the Selma to Montgomery March. Even though Hannah is a Black, queer, and neurodivergent femme from the Deep South, she has had the privilege to attend two prestigious institutions of higher education, Hampton University and the University of Pennsylvania, that have enabled her to pursue a career at the intersections of public service, storytelling, and activism. After working in different capacities in communications field, Hannah began working with nonprofits. As community programs manager for Mount Airy CDC, Hannah spearheaded the organization's public live initiatives, which included the launch of Love Park. Hannah is currently a self-employed creative writer, community engagement and social justice consultant, yoga teacher, and activist based in West Philadelphia, who is also a core organizer for Black Lives Matter Philadelphia. Poet, teacher, lecturer Lee Hinton is the author of 6 poetry collections, including most recently, Sing Silence. His work has been widely published and can be found in the Best American Poetry 2014, the Baltimore Review, the Pittsburgh Poetry Review, the Somerset Review, the Skinny Poetry Journal, Valley Voices, a literary review, and many other publications. His poem, Epidemic, was honored by the Pennsylvania Center for the Book, and the Hour Ballpark can be found outside Clipper Magazine Stadium in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, incorporated into Derek Parker's sculpture, Common Thread. Whitney Lupton has a bachelor's degree in social work from Millersville University and is a native of Philadelphia. She brings to the table lots of experience in volunteer services and recruitment, youth development, and community engagement. Whitney works as the social media marketing manager for the Cultured Professional, TCP, Network, which is a podcast and radio program that aims to highlight the voices of the disenfranchised in central Pennsylvania. TCP's mission is to share the stories and voices of marginalized people and groups, and to keep an underrepresented population on the happenings in their backyard by providing information, inspiration, and entertainment from the people directly to the people with no filters and no borders. And our moderator, Ryan Freeman, currently serves as a success coach at Millersville University, where he works to empower students to achieve academic and personal success. Ryan graduated from Millersville University as an undergraduate student in 2014 and eventually went on to achieve his master's degree in social work from Millersville University in 2016. Ryan has served the Millersville community in several capacities, most notably with the Office of Student Success Programs as a program coordinator for the Pre-Scholar Summer Institute, where he worked to prepare and support students as they entered the university. Ryan continues to play a pivotal role in student success and retention at Millersville. In his current position as a success coach, he provides holistic academic support to the students. I wish to thank all of our panelists and our moderator. Lee, the floor is yours. Lee, I believe he unmute.
In listening to the film and watching the film, it occurred to me that we will be listening to our ancestors. So in honor of that, I have this poem that I will offer to you. It's called Benediction. May you sit with an ancestor in the grace of a front porch. After he's sharecropped for 12 straight hours, may you touch his scraped palms. The meandering scars on his body are the trails of your flight north. Listen to the psalm rise from his frame, bending 10,000 times each day, ignoring the ache and the bowl's tiny cuts. May you sit with an ancestor, the meandering scars on his body, a sacrament, a prayer, a hope. Ask him how to pick this cotton, its soft white sin, a debt.
Thank you, Lee. Lee, Hannah, Whitney, welcome to Millersville University, and thank you for being with us tonight. It's an honor to be in the space and to have you with us. As we transition into our discussion portion of the evening, I will be offering up some questions for you guys. And as we go through, please share your heart and transparency, and I know you will, and I look forward to this portion. So I'm just going to start off. I'm just going to offer up a question. As these questions resonate, please feel free to open and answer. So the first question is, what is the legacy of slavery, segregation, and Jim Crow in our culture? And how do these historical institutions affect contemporary society?
If you guys don't mind, I'd like to kind of touch on that first. I think that so much of our community in 2020, we believe that those things are things of the past, but they all built upon each other. So from slavery, you got sharecropping. From sharecropping, you got Jim Crow. From Jim Crow, you got redlining. And from redlining, you got the school to prison pipeline. So the thing is that slavery just changed its name. It just, it's a different name, but it's still the same society. Is that when we can see it and when we can name it, we can fight it. If we ignore it, if we act like it's not there, it'll continue to metastasize and grow, and we can see that now. We can see the hatred in our communities. We can see the racism in our communities because we've spent years trying to ignore it as if it's not a thing. Almost something that's hushed, something that we shouldn't be talking about. But the news is that Black people have been having these conversations in our kitchens for years. I talked about gentrification with my father my entire childhood. And this was even a So I think that it's important that we educate ourselves and we continue to have these conversations with our friends, with our families, and with people that we come across in our day-to-day lives. That's it. I just wanted to really, because that's really important for me, is that sharing that information. People think, oh, it was slavery, that's done. But it just changed its name and it just kept changing its form.
Thank you.
Absolutely agree. I mean, that's practically what I was going to say, just that they all exist under different names now in different forms. And we've been disillusioned or taught otherwise. And it really contradicts, the reality that many still experience. That our schools and neighborhoods are just as stratified and segregated. Like you said, that mass incarceration in prison is a direct descendant of slavery and the slave trade. That there's still sundown towns and public lynchings. So, if we're thinking that any of that has disappeared, it's more so that they've transformed and that the tools and technology has changed. But many of those circumstances are very much still alive and well.
Thank you.
One of the things we should keep in mind is that it's not really that long ago.
Mm.
Some of the conversations that I've had have been sort of like, oh, that was such a long time ago, slavery, that shouldn't affect us now. But I'd like to usually point out that my mother she's still alive and she's 90 years old. Her mother lived to be 93 years old and was born in 1897. My mother will tell stories to us about what she had to go through as a child, which affects me, of course, and my family. And it's not as if we're talking about 500 years ago and no one can remember what it was like. My mother just fairly recently told a story, which I found kind of interesting, in that she lives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And as a child, she was probably about 6 years old. She went to the Susquehanna River to watch the fireworks on the 4th of July. And they had a good time. She enjoyed it with one of her brothers and her mom. And they were walking back and they wanted to have an ice cream cone at one of the shops. And they stopped in and they weren't served. They were refused. Now, that's my mother telling me directly her experience. So it's not some distant story that I have to read or is made up. I can actually touch and hold and kiss the person who tells me that story. So that certainly affects me. And for those people who claim to say, well, that shouldn't bother you anymore, I would just point out, what are the things that you never think about because they were so long ago in your life? Most of us have things that we'll always carry with us, whether we're 25 and we think about Christmas at 5 years old, or whether we're 75 and we think about something that happened in college when we were 20. So it wasn't that long ago. And all of these things still continue and they live inside of us. The emotional scars are always there.
Thank you for that, for those thoughts. The second question, all the leaders associated with the civil rights movement, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Robert Kennedy, were murdered. What message did this send to the American people about civil rights in this country?
As crazy as it is, I think that we can kind of see some of that now here in Lancaster, with some of our protesters who had their bail set at $1 million apiece. Some of them have since come down and they have been bailed out, but the initial response was $1 million bail. And so that is to keep people in fear. You know, there are people that are afraid to go back downtown and protest. There are people afraid to become the next Martin Luther King. There are people that are afraid to become the next Malcolm X because they're worried about the things that they'll say and how it can be perceived by others, and if they'll have their lives put into jeopardy. My organization, the Culture Professional, there were people who called us a terrorist group. And we're just trying to share the stories of people of color, of marginalized groups. And they're like, yeah, report them to the FBI and things of that nature, because people are afraid to see marginalized groups evolve and have a say in mainstream society. There seems to be an issue with allowing marginalized groups a seat at the table. And we see this with women. We see this with the LGBTQ community. And so the point is really to stop people before it gets too far. And then because, you know, we keep our children ignorant in the school systems, that they never learn what their rights really are. And so as they grow up, they never have a chance to really become the next Martin Luther King or become the next Malcolm X, because they're not taught and they're afraid.
Thank you.
I actually have a little bit of pushback for this question for a few reasons. I don't think that it's helpful for us to kind of frame it as all of our leaders were murdered. And I think that that's a narrative that we need to continue to kind of like examine and disrupt. And it is absolutely true. I'm sorry if folks can hear me. It is true that many of our leaders, prominent figures, were indeed assassinated during that time. But it's also the case that we know now that many of those assassinations were conspired by or like in collusion with the state. And it's a strategy that has been long used to kind of disempower and dismantle movements. And perhaps there was, you know, some success in that narrative has persisted, in that we continue to think that is the case and has to be the case anytime that there is a movement like this. But the truth is that folks have never stopped organizing. Folks have never stopped resisting. We've never stopped making forward progress. And so if that were the case, you know, we wouldn't have had like a 1 million man march in the 90s. You know, if that were the case, we wouldn't have a BLM today, right? So we have to understand that our movements are not and cannot be based off of any single person. In fact, our movements are full of leaders. And, you know, when I think about that era, you know, like John Lewis wasn't killed, Rosa Parks wasn't killed, you know, Fannie Lou Hamer wasn't killed. There are so many folks who did survive and continued that work to this day. And we might not know all of their names. And part of that is also strategic because we've never heard the full stories, right? And so this kind of idea of, you know, having a narrative and controlling the narrative is important, that we know our history, that we continue to share our stories. But we also have to kind of acknowledge that we all have things that we can contribute that are unique to movements, that we have leadership qualities that are waiting to be stepped into, right? So what we're looking for is not someone outside of ourselves. It's, you know, really for us to tap into that leadership and be the people that we've been waiting for. And then one final point I think about leaders is that they're often framed as, you know, these male figures, right? And it often blatantly overlooks the leadership and the contributions that femmes, that are trans and our queer family, that are disabled folks have always been making to these movements, right? and have always been on the front lines of all of these struggles. And so I think that's something we can all do better in terms of regarding like who we are uplifting as our leaders, or who we're recognizing in their contributions, and being, you know, more intentional about like centering and amplifying different folks' voices.
Nicely said. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. One of the things that I personally love about Black Lives Matter is that there isn't a concerted effort to push someone to the forefront. And I think the reasons for that make great sense. That we all are leaders. If you are in a family, if you've ever been in a group that had to do something, if you've been on a sports team, there is no one person that actually leads the team, despite what football likes to think. At different times, it requires different tools, and there are many, many people who are able to provide those tools. So to say that Martin Luther King, after he died, the movement just disappeared, isn't quite totally accurate, because there were so many other people who were doing some of the same things, but maybe they weren't quite as articulate. I think in America, we tend to always look at the more articulate person, but sometimes it's the person who isn't articulate in front of thousands of people, but is very articulate in a room filled with just 5 or 6 people, who is then able to get that information across, and then those 5 or 6 people will move that along the line. And that's sort of how most movements really work. But in telling stories and in giving history, that's how we tell history. It's always these particular people. And in America, if we were to look at the way we present history in America, then we've had 44 leaders. We've had 44 presidents. And we all know that's not quite the case.
Yeah. It's like we're the continuation of the work. And that's powerful. And that's powerful. Yeah. So really want to hear you guys' thoughts. Is there a distinction between civil rights and social justice today? And if so, in what ways do they differ?
I'm happy to start. I definitely think that it's a lineage. Like you said, it's a continuation of the work. And just like any kind of lineage or family tree, you know, each generation has its own kind of identity and things that it contributes uniquely. But it's often in response or like a development or continuation of what's existed before it. Um, and so what I think we have today that's a little bit distinctive is like a better like analysis and like understanding of how issues are often like interconnected and more intersectional than what we thought. And so, you know, for instance, if we're talking about the climate, we have to acknowledge how that also impacts communities of color differently than everybody else, right? So it's not just a single issue, that there's many layers to all of these things that we have a better like understanding of the nuances. But along with that, there's like, it creates a lot more like ambiguity. And so we have to also be comfortable with understanding that there's not like a single solution or like a single way to go about fixing all of these issues that are so like connected as a web, right? We're gonna have to be okay with trying a lot of different approaches, with not always agreeing with all of the approaches, with failing sometimes and trying again. It's really going to have to be a much more like adaptive and evolving process than what I think folks are really understanding or prepared for. And we just have to be comfortable with this trying and trying again, because really we have this idea that, you know, we have to create a perfect movement, or we have to come up with a perfect solution, and often that's like the enemy of us actually being able to make progress.
I just wanted to add that it's a spectrum, right? So civil rights and social justice, they are almost two sides of the same coin. It just looks different. And I think that for most of us, it's finding how do we become involved. You know, there's so many different organizations that are out here doing the work of social justice, of civil rights, that it becomes the issue of, well, how do I get involved? Which organization is the right organization? Which one is really going to be for the people? Which organization is really going to make the change that I want to see in the world? And the thing is that the truth is that any of them will work. They all do a different job to support the movement. So there are, you know, the Working Families campaigns, there's Black Lives Matter, there's the Black Futures Lab. There are different organizations, and they are all taking up a torch to offer support for, to move legislation forward, to move social justice forward. But the organizations are here, the groundwork is available. I think that we shouldn't get caught up on the nuances of, is it social justice? Is it civil rights? Is it this? Is it that? Is it going to make a difference? And can you help them make that difference? And the thing is that the organizations are out here. You can find them on Instagram. You can find them on Facebook. It's really about getting involved at this point. And if you want to do the work, and if you want to see the change, get involved.
I think the period of time that we normally think of as the civil rights era was a time when the actual laws that were in place were unfair, and the focus was on those laws and changing those laws. And some of those things were changed, but then there's always the pushback from those change of laws. And then there has to be a pushback to the pushback, which in some ways could be considered social justice movement. But it's not okay to jail someone and not tell anyone about it at all, but it still gets done. In the civil rights era, there may not have been a law specifically to prevent that. That changed, but still that won't keep people from being jailed with $1 million bails that make no sense. So with social justice, it's what we do in order to push back against the changes that were pushed back against civil rights. That's the kind of difference I may see in it, but essentially I agree that it's just another step along the way.
Thank you. Man, I have this question, and I think it's a good question. So now I'm like, we're at my house, we're at the kitchen table, it's just us, right? We sitting here, I'm gonna ask this question. And so the question I have, and this is kind of off script, but is racial reconciliation possible in America? Is racial reconciliation possible? Now, this is the one where, you know, somebody stand up or we like, okay, but I'm feeling it, and I'm just like, look, we got to talk about it. So let's let them in. Like, is racial reconciliation possible?
I'm just gonna keep my mute button on. No, it can be dependent on the individual. People are infinitely different. So I think that becomes a question of the individual, who we're talking about, what are we talking about, why are they trying to make this change? Because you got to think of American history. Like, I mean, this land, this country was built on some of the nastiest stuff you can ever imagine. So to talk about racial reconciliation, well, first of all, you're going to have a whole lot of Americans admit that slavery happened, admit that it was wrong, and admit to the lifestyles and legislation that passed thereafter, continuing to keep an entire society of people oppressed. So that's a lot. But I would definitely say that it depends on the individual. What are you looking to gain? How are you hoping to grow? Is this like a spiritual thing for the individual? Like, what does that mean? Because I definitely don't think it looks like if you identify as a white person, you need to agree to this. If you identify as a white Hispanic, you need to agree to this. It's more about the individual. That sounds like really something for someone who might have been living a hateful life, and they're realizing that, oh man, this was wrong. I was wrong. But I can't see it as like an entire group thing for people to come to the table and everybody agree. I mean, not all people of color agree on everything, so there's no way that I see a race reconciliation. I don't even think that could be a thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that is really, really tricky. I would say I think there are things that can happen legislatively that can help rectify, do some of that reconciliation work. I mean, reparations is huge, right? There has to be some kind of reckoning and repayment from a federal and systemic level to kind of level that playing field, right? But that does not guarantee that those changes will happen in people's hearts, right? And that those changes will happen on an individual level. That's a whole other thing. So I think that there is like some work that can be done to make the country more fair, more balanced on a racial equity level. But if we're talking about reconciliation, like, systemic, individual, economic, social, all of the things, I don't know how that works. I don't know how that happens. But I'm hopeful. I would like to be hopeful. I want to be optimistic. I think that the future of this country really does depend on there being some like righting of wrongs. And if there's not like some kind of effort to be in right relationship with each other, we're all gonna go down in this ship. So that's what it is.
For me, it depends on which day you ask me. There are days where I'm hopeful. I think things are going to be okay. And then there are other days where I just see no way at all. A few years ago, maybe 5, 6 years ago, I was talking with a friend at work and the person was pointing out that sometime in the middle of the century that we would become majority minority. And I thought, well, that's okay. That's what America is all about. And that person wasn't particularly happy with that idea. That person was white. And then I began to think, well, maybe we can get through all of this and we'll be okay. If we get through all of this by 2060, 2070, this country will see even greater heights. But then the last several years have happened and I'm not sure anymore. I'm not sure that we will survive the next 25 years. So it sort of depends on what day you ask me. And there are times when I think this country is going to be absolutely wonderful. And there are times when I think that 3 or 4 decades from now, this country will be in about 4 or 5 different pieces. So I guess my answer is, I don't know. which is okay.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. um, my final question, but knowing me, I might have one more. Um, what is the American dream? And I've asked this question. I know it's very broad but just your thoughts on what is the American dream today, and how is it being experienced, or how do you see it from your lived experience right now?
Well, I actually don't think that the American dream is a thing. I think that it was just a capitalist idea set up to get us to buy more merchandise and put stuff on credit. However, I think that the American dream is just to this idea of freedom, right? This idea of Black people not being afraid to drive their cars down the street, not being concerned about the police, not being worried that they're going to get paid $20,000 less than their white peers and they're more qualified. Um, so I think that the American dream looks like real equality. It looks like equal pay for the same job. It looks like being able to live in whatever neighborhood I want to live in and not getting a house where the deed says don't sell to Black people. That's what I think that the American dream is. It's really to this idea of being able to live my best life, whether I'm an entrepreneur or an employee, and not having a fear of retaliation from my peers of my doing well. Because we've seen in the past, that there are issues with businesses owned by people of color getting loan money or getting access to resources. So just making sure that there is fair, equitable access to resources, to me seems like the American dream now.
Um, I definitely agree that the American dream doesn't really exist. Um, but I actually really enjoyed this question because it made me think about, um, I kind of see America as a dream itself. Not like not in terms of like goals, like something you aspire to, but that it's like not ever something that has like a full state of consciousness, right? It's like all of these putting together of images and emotions and really abstract things, that are more like a projection, than anything that's ever like real that you actually experience, right? So I don't ever feel like there's ever been this um, authentic or honest like conversation or conception of what America is. It's all been a dream. And it's either this kind of nostalgic dream of something that never existed, that people have tried to rewrite, or it's always this like trying to move forward to some kind of either utopia or dystopia, depending on where you are, in that conversation, right? Um, so yeah, I think the American dream is can be anything, and it also like means nothing. But I think we're living in a time that feels also like a dream, right? It's like it's so fantastical and like you know nice, some nightmarish at times, right? It's like what are we dreaming? Is this a dream that we're in? And I think it's important though that we still like practice our ability to dream up something, anything that's better than what we're experiencing now, right? Like that's our task, is for us to continue to dream up something that has to be better, and it has to be something that we've not experienced yet. So that's my tag. Like, whatever the American dream is, we have to figure out what that is from now on and like live into it.
I love that.
That's sort of how I look at the American dream. There's nothing really in place right now. It's almost as if you're talking to someone who hasn't been to sleep in about a week, and you ask them, well, how was your dream last night? How did you have any wonderful dreams? And they say, I haven't slept in a week. I don't have any dreams at this point. I will take anything that I can get. If I fall asleep in the middle of the day for 20 minutes and I dream that I'm playing basketball and I just hit a three-pointer and I scored, I'll take that as a dream. And we are sort of in the process of redefining whatever kind of American dream we might have. So I don't see us having an American dream right now because we haven't gotten to the point where we are even one to have a dream. If there is a dream, it's 300 million different dreams and not one or even a half a dozen different dreams, because I know for myself, I want to be able to go out at night, walk my dog, and not have these horror fantasies of someone driving by and possibly shooting me because I happen to be an African American in the wrong neighborhood. Even though most people would look at who's walking a dog at night, he must live in this neighborhood. But those are the kind of things that I think about, and I'd like to have a dream where I don't think that way.
It's almost as if we don't have the privilege to sleep. So because we don't have the privilege to sleep, we can't dream. So when we hear those who speak of dreams and vivid colors and amazing experiences, we look confused because we say we haven't slept. And to be unaware of one's surrounding, but yet experience all the benefits of being awake even when sleep is a fantasy to us. It's a fantasy. So I just resonate so much with the comments. Yes. Yes.
I just wanted to say that actually kind of reminds me of Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folks. And he talks about this veil that Black people live in. Like there's all of America, but we are living in this veil, in that life, that American dream is just out of our reach. And it's interesting because it's like he said these things in the early 1900s and they still are applicable today in 2020.
Yes. And I think that's such a great way to bring this together, because we started talking with Lee's poem about our ancestors and their sleep, their resting. And we're ending our comments reflecting on the fact that we identify with a group and we're part of a group that is restless because they're not able to sleep and to dream. So I just appreciate this time. I appreciate the thoughts so far. I'm excited to jump into this film tonight and to hear further thoughts afterwards. But at this time, I'll just kind of wrap our time up in this discussion. And I hope for those who are listening, it really started to just prime your mind and even your emotions and even your intellect about these topics, about this conversation. Is so broad, so deep, so complex. But I hope maybe some of you, even for the first time, are starting to consider some of these things and then the role you're going to play in it. So it's great. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much, Ryan and Lee, Hannah, and Whitney. You certainly have got me thinking, and I appreciate all your comments and your thoughts, and I'm going to continue to reflect as we move into the next part of tonight's event, which is to watch the screening of I Am Not Your Negro. In just a moment, Shayna is going to insert a link. So because we had to switch to virtual and we're all adjusting and pivoting, which seems to be the new word of the day, we are going to provide you with two options. So this documentary is now available on YouTube. And so the link that Shayna just put in the chat is the link directly to the YouTube where you can watch it there. There are a few little commercials. You can skip through them as they come up. Or if you have a Netflix account, you can go right to Netflix and you can watch it there. We wanted to avoid showing it through Zoom because the sound can sometimes get affected. And so since it's available on 2 other platforms, we are going to do it that way. You do not have to turn off or leave this Zoom session. You can just open up another browser and log in, watch the documentary, and then we just ask that you return at, Shayna, can you insert the, we want you to return for the discussion at 8:20. So be sure that you are back by 8:20. If you return back by 8:20, we are going to continue the discussion, and this will give you an opportunity to pose questions directly to our panelist, and Ryan will continue to moderate that. So we will see you at 8:20. Thank you.
Let's have some dialogue, and I would just like to ask the panel just immediate reactions, and then we'll jump in to some of the questions being asked in the chat. So if you have any questions for the panel, I would just ask that at this time that you throw them in the chat, and we will start discussing. But just to give people time to throw some questions in, some immediate reactions from the film.
Yeah, well, I will say this was my first time rewatching it since it was released. I saw this film in theaters and had not seen it again since. And so it was really illuminating to rewatch it now. I believe the first time was shortly after like Ferguson and the inception of BLM, and to have this context where we just had like a second uprising in so many years was really also interesting to have that added context of what we're going through now, and how like a lot of folks have said in the chat, how does this happen? How does this continue to happen? How do we keep coming to this kind of breaking point to a head? And so I think I'm still, as many folks are, processing a lot of things that I watched, but I appreciate it as a piece of work that stands up, and unfortunately is something that we will probably have to continue to revisit every couple of years to remind ourselves.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, I had seen a lot of the comments going off in the chat. And one of my immediate reactions, because I as well had seen the movie when it first came out. As I'm watching it, again, I'm just hearing a lot of the same sentiments that people are expressing today with their concerns about America, being Black in America, and just how history is really happening right now, and the same stories are happening right now. Something that he mentioned about the Christian church and not trusting white Christians, I thought really stood out because I have heard a lot of concerns about LBC and their Black students and some of the issues of discrimination and microaggressions that they face on campus. So again, we're just seeing across the board that these things are continuing to happen year after year, decade after decade. And it's just like, at what point does the change really come? And so I don't know if it's because it is a systemic problem. I don't know if we need to start with legislation and how that moves at a snail's pace, and maybe it needs to move a little bit faster. But we really need to start looking at how do we start moving forward for some real concrete change, because how do we keep having these same conversations over and over, decade after decade?
I've watched the film probably 5 times now. And what struck me is how many times throughout the film he emphasized, which is really, really important, and we don't seem to understand, that what happens to Black America happens to the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way that we can separate that. So in some way, we have to find some way to get through these times, to not have 1965, 1968, 2014, 1991, and now 2020 repeat themselves every so often. There has to be some way, otherwise there won't be an America, not in America as we know it. The land may be here, although with climate change, we may not even have that. But we can't, it simply isn't going, even if someone wants to send everyone back to wherever they came from, that just isn't going to work. So we need to confront it, we need to face it, and we need to do something.
Just you guys are doing a good job posting. Let me see. So, question from Benjamin. Do you think that there is enough emphasis being put on getting specific legislation passed, such as ending qualified immunity, legislating drugs, demilitarizing the police, and ending no-knock raids? So he's asking, do you think there's enough emphasis on those legislation changes?
I can speak from my experience as an organizer with BLM and say that one of the reasons why we are now at the point where we're calling for the full defunding and abolishing of the police is that we have gone the route of legislation time and time again to have reforms that are either not substantial or are not upheld and followed, right? And so one of the reasons we're saying is like we can have legislation. We've had legislation before. I think that was a point that Lee said about like the civil rights movement was the move to have a lot of these things like made into law, right? That you cannot discriminate. And yet our lived conditions, are the realities that we face have not changed despite those legislations, right? So it's not just about what's on the books. There are a lot of things that can be legislated, that can be made legal. It won't necessarily change how things are executed, how people live their lives, how people are experiencing their lives, right? But I do think that we can't completely throw that away as one of the strategies, but it has to be both from top down and bottom up, that we have to be also always pushing against, always keeping people accountable, always moving the needle while, like you said, that long and snail length of changing legislation happens. We have to be keeping the fire on folks to keep moving it forward.
So, so a lot of the talk here in Lancaster is definitely about best practices, learning new tactics, how to better handle situations, getting more social workers on the force. And that's kind of the conversation on this end of town. However, I do think that policing is rooted in slave catching. They're rooted in the oppression of Black bodies. And so we have to look at that and look at how that's implemented in its structure today. Again, where's the accountability? We've seen a police officer kill a white woman who had come out of her home with a knife. And he, he's in prison. But then we see officers kill Black men on our televisions day in and day out, and we're waiting for justice. So we definitely need to look at practices if police is going to be around, and then we also need to look at training and how can citizens feel safe. I don't know if Black society will necessarily ever
Okay. It seems like Whitney dropped out for a second. Does anyone else want to speak to that question? Are you back?
I'll just say that I agree wholeheartedly with Hannah that there has to be a top down and bottom up. We have to focus on laws, but we also can't have that be the only focus, because there seems to be always ways to get around laws, and there has to be some sort of change from the inside in the behavior of everyday ordinary people, and also not tolerating something that doesn't affect you. Over the past, well, probably this year, the term anti-racism is a term that's been used more often, while before it was just a matter of not being racist. So it was okay, kind of, in 1980 if your uncle was racist. You invited him to Thanksgiving, and it was okay if he said something stupid and racist, and you just ignore that and say, oh, that's Uncle Joe. He just does those kinds of things. One of the changes that is a bit more encouraging is that now it's a matter of, we're not going to invite Uncle Joe because he's a racist, and even if he is our uncle, we don't want him around anymore. So the anti-racism is a positive step, I think, for the country. But we need more of that, not just changes in law, because you find ways around that. And if our hearts haven't changed, the laws aren't going to change those.
That's good. Here's a question from Elizabeth. Do you think it is possible for an individual to participate within the systems that oppress people of color, like the criminal justice system, without supporting that system itself? Is it possible that a person with good intentions to bring about change on an individual level?
Well, I think something that that question made me think about is how Lee just mentioned this like concept of anti-racism, and so I think someone else has mentioned Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is a good book to check out. But he has this idea that you're either racist or you're anti-racist. There's not any like not being racist, right? So if you're not actively acting against racism and systemic oppression, you are by default helping to continue it, right? So if you're somebody who is within a system and you're saying, I'm not actively, harming anybody, but I'm also not actively changing all of the things that I see that are violent, that are wrong, then I am by default condoning it and helping it to continue. So if you are somebody who is within the system and you are in a position to make some change, which all of us are in positions to make some kind of change, whether on the smallest scale, right? And you're not choosing to do those changes, to make those changes, then you're by default helping to continue oppression. You are an active, your inaction is actively helping to perpetuate oppression, right? So if you're in a system and you have any kind of power, if you believe that you can work within a system, then you have to do what you can do to make whatever changes on whatever scale that you can.
Right. I totally agree with that, Hannah. And just to piggyback off of that, and that within, if you are, I know somebody mentioned like being in the criminal justice system or even within like social services or nonprofit organizations, just think about the intentionality of your work. And think about how can you help fight systemic racism today. Be on the lookout for it. You can see it if you are aware of it, if you are conscious of it, and think about how you can implement that in your day-to-day work so that you can be an advocate while you're out there, working, and doing that due diligence of fighting, that fight that Black people face every day, and becoming an ally and again, an advocate. And it might even be like a little conversation at lunch with a coworker. Maybe somebody might say something that's like, oh, that's a little, racist. Like, and those are those moments, and seizing those opportunities and definitely, again, becoming an advocate and an ally when those situations arise. I know Lee had mentioned, the uncle coming to Thanksgiving. It's just not enough to not say anything at all, but you need to speak up and you need to be vocal, because the power is in your voice. The power is in somebody else being able to hear back, that was wrong, that was inappropriate. And sometimes it just takes that little conversation to get everything started.
Good.
A lot of times, some of the changes that occur within someone's heart are the small changes. It's not some big meeting that he went to. It's not something that he read. It may be just a quiet something that a neighbor or a family member says. So yes, you can sort of work from the inside. You can be a little bit more subversive. Sometimes change comes from the inside, small changes.
So feel free to have the questions keep rolling in. While scan, I'll present a question. So in the film, there's a scene where a black man is faced with a decision whether to stay on the train or jump off the train. And I have a question for the panel. Today, in what ways do you see in our society, are Black people still asked, in what ways are Black people still asked to jump off the train? If that makes sense, if you see what I'm trying to ask with that. And why do you think Black people are still asked, in some sense, to jump off the train?
I think that's a really good question. That's a really difficult question. What that made me think of, I saw somebody recently comment about like white allyship, and so what that makes me think of is just like this need, this desire to still want to reassure white people that, you know, like, you're a good person, you've done the right things, you're doing all that, even if it's at the detriment of your personal experience, or your feelings. And so I see that a lot with you know, power dynamics with like coworkers or with friends, still wanting to, you know, have that feeling that like, oh, I see that you're trying, or I know that you have good intentions, even if that's still having an adverse impact on myself, and my mental health and my reality, right? And so I very much still see that as the way that we have to, or, you know, we often feel compelled to jump off the train.
Yeah.
So actually, I really can't think of any instances where I would want Black people to jump off the train. Everybody I know wants him to stay on the train. And the example that I can best think of was the NBA, the 2-day strike that they had. And some friends and I, we had a heated discussion that lasted about an hour on how it wasn't long enough. Like, people wanted them to stay on the train a lot longer, and they jumped off. And so the thing in jumping off was, well, they can get a little bit of what they were looking for now. Let's see where the NBA goes with this. Let's see if they make the moves that they said that they were going to do. But if it, happens again, we can get back on the train. But a lot of people are saying, like, no, they should have waited. Let it last a week. Let it last 2 weeks. And then see what happens, see what kind of change is made, then see what kind of policy is implemented after that point. Yeah. So I just, I don't know. I can't even in good faith say I would want anybody to jump off the train. Like, I think that we're past, I think it's called white fragility. And if you follow me on social media, I'm not here for it. But I do think that is like some interpersonal healing that has to take place. Like, if you feel as though that you've been out here wronging, people of color, that you have been out here being malicious, that you have been out here using your power and your privilege to help oppress people of color, if you feel that in your heart, then that is something that you need to look inside, and that you need to do some inner work for. And you can't look for Black people to help validate you being on the right path. Like, that is just work that you have to do, within yourself.
In the film, it was mentioned several times by several white participants in the film that progress was being made. And that's something that could be said at any point in American history, that progress is being made. So even now, with all the awareness that we have that we may not have had, that white America may not have had 30 years ago, 60 years ago, we will still get people who are sort of saying in different terms, but we've made progress. But we're better than we were 10 years ago. We had a Black president, so things can't be that bad. But they are that bad. And one president isn't going to change things, and we aren't going to not tell you anymore. And I think in some ways there are some segment of America that kind of expected Black people to just be quiet and go away after you got a Black president. We gave you that, so shut up. You don't have any problems now. And that certainly isn't true at all. So I think in that way, they kind of expect us to jump off the train and not say anything anymore. And maybe in some ways, that's why there's some pushback among middle America, among what so-called moderate white Americans, is that they'll never be satisfied, except they don't live in our world and they don't experience the things that we experience, so they don't know. But also, I think in some cases, they don't care.
Yeah. It's interesting because when I think of allyship, I think of a white individual saying, stay on the train. You have to stay on the train. And so just definitely resonating with the comments that are being made by the panelists. So here's a question from, if I didn't lose it, from Bailey. What are your thoughts on WOW allyship, and is there ever a point where white voices take up too much space in the movement for racial justice? What is your advice for allies and advocates?
My advice is to listen first. It's the same advice I give men. Men should shut up a lot of times. When it comes to women issues, we don't have a say. We don't have to have an opinion. We sometimes need to just shut up, listen, and in some cases do what our women tell us to do, because we don't have those experiences. So the same thing applies in this case, that with white allyship, you first need to listen and learn, and not have an opinion. Don't feel you have an opinion or a point of view or anything. And that process may take a very, very long time, especially if you're used to having an opinion and voicing that opinion.
Yeah, I just saw someone comment that it's time's up for allyship. It's time to see yourself as an accomplice. So if you don't see this as some aspect of this work as something that you own, that you're responsible for, that is, it has an effect on you, then you're not actually an ally. You feel like you're a savior. You feel like you are a martyr. You feel like you want to get your good person badge, right? You're not really in this fight. So if you don't see this as your fight, then you're not actually here for the right reasons. So that's one of my, you have to have some real skin in the game. You really have to be making some sacrifices on your part. And so if you're not willing to do that, then you're not actually in this for the right reasons.
No, you guys both just summed it up so beautifully. I'm just back here just nodding my head like, absolutely.
So another question from a student, it seems, what kind of changes do you feel like need to be implemented in our system of mainstream social media in this country regarding bias for political reasons or for profit/ratings? And how much of an effect do you think this has on dividing us today?
So there are just so many things that make social media great, and that make things spread virally. I think that social media is a tool, right? So it's best if we learn how to use that tool. The thing is that a lot of us don't know how to best utilize it. And so we become a victim of it. We spend too much time on there. It's tracking all of our information and it's showing us more of what we've been telling it we want to see, versus us being more strategic in how we use social media, so that we're not a victim to any of the new narratives that are kind of going across social media with the way that the world should be, is, or how people are trying to portray it. I think it's best that with social media, try to get into groups, try to find people with whom you would like to connect with. There are lots of little niche communities where you can meet like-minded people, find supports and resources, and as well as meet other people who are local and nearby, so that you can continue to grow and expand yourself, and it actually helps expand your social media network, so that you're not continuing to see what the algorithms are actually tracking for. But it gives you an opportunity to throw it off and really kind of harness it for what you want it to be.
And I think I definitely agree with what Winnie has said. Social media is a tool, and it can be a really powerful tool when you do know how to use it. We would not have a BLM were it not for social media, right? And so that ability to connect, to share ideas, to kind of think through like the discourse that it can provide, I think is all really important to our movements right now. But with that being said, you have to, be very mindful and discerning in how you are engaging with it. And I think if you are connected to the right people, if you know how to use it, if you are connected to organizers, if you're using it in that way, it continues to be a really good tool for us to organize. But then that also reminded me of how important it is for us to be able to like share our stories and be able to be mindful of, our narratives and how we have more of a democratic, possibility through social media to have that. But once again, it becomes so cluttered with like everybody's thoughts, everybody's voice being out there. So it's really about, developing that discernment, that ability to kind of get through all of the chaos and the clutter to what the real messages are that resonate with you and that can be used as powerful like organizing tools.
Great. Thank you.
I think one of the things we have to remind ourselves is, as you mentioned, that it is just a tool and it's one tool. And the tools we had before then and the tools that we'll have after this are also tools that can be useful. And we need to make sure that we use the correct tools at the correct time. There are some times when social media at least the way we're using it now, may not be very useful at all. And there are other times when, particularly if you're lean towards old school communication, where that way of communicating and interacting with others just doesn't work. You have to do those things socially. So we need all the tools, whatever they happen to be, and social media is certainly really a valuable tool in this day and age, especially since we're not talking about a small village. We're talking about millions and billions of people in the world, not just this country.
So good. Great. So I want to respect the time and respect the space. So we're at the end of our time this evening for this discussion portion, but I just appreciate the conversation, the dialogue. It was very informative, very insightful, and I just want to thank you guys for the time. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Rice.
Thank you, Ryan. And I would like to say thank you again to all of our panelists and to you, Ryan. We couldn't have brought this event to everyone tonight without all of you bringing your expertise and your willingness to join us. So again, I truly am thankful. Also want to thank our participants. You know, this is a difficult conversation and we appreciate your willingness to join us tonight and begin this conversation. For many, it might be the start of your own journey, but for all of us, we hope that you did glean something new from tonight's event and that you're able to apply that either personally or professionally as we all work together in order to promote racial justice. When we talk about racial justice work, it is ongoing. And it does require constant reflection, change, and as Hannah mentioned, sacrifices if we really want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And so for that reason, the Learning Institute is committed to offer practical resources to help you on your journey, regardless of where you are. So within the next couple days, you're going to receive an email from us. That email is going to contain a list of resources for you in order to guide you and to assist you as you continue your own personal journey. It also will include a link for those of you who are looking for continuing education credits, but we encourage everybody to complete the survey as we welcome your feedback regarding tonight's event, as well as just any additional knowledge, skills, services that you would like us to offer in order to promote justice and human rights. So again, I want to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Ryan, for moderating tonight's event. Together, when we are willing to listen and to learn and to collaborate, we can truly make a difference and be part of the change. So I want to thank all of you and have a wonderful night.
Thank you all for a great session.